I'm DB, aka Danielle Bezalel, and I'll be your host for the next 6 episodes of this podcast and beyond.
Sex,
birth control,
bondage, domination, sadism, and masochism.
Everyone took the condoms, blew them up in the hallway.
Conversations about STI and safer sex did not happen.
My first time I saw a condom, I was 20 years old.
Never do anything that doesn't feel right to you. Otherwise, you're not consenting.
I don't need to know about a penis's anatomy.
I want to be someone who talks more about it openly to degrossify it.
So there we were, starting a sex ed club. Welcome to Sex Ed with DB, an intersectional feminist podcast for folks who want to hear real stories from 5 Bay Area voices as we try to revolutionize the way we talk about sex. This is episode 1. Right after I graduated from UC Berkeley, I went to Rishon LeZion, Israel for 1 year to teach English. We took a field trip to a very religious community in Jerusalem called the Community of the Bells. One of the main rabbis gave us a tour of the synagogue there and told us about his family and his traditions. He told our group that he had 5 daughters, and that when all of his daughters eventually turned 17 respectively, they would each be married by the matchmaker and hopefully get pregnant that night. That's literally what he said. That's the first night they learn about sex, he said. I immediately thought to myself, I'm sorry, what? As my hand shot up in a fury, the rabbi nodded in my direction. It felt like all eyes were on me. I proceeded to say, don't you think it's wrong that your daughters don't learn about sex before they're expected to have it? And thought to myself, what if they're not ready to be mothers? What about their consent? He looked at me for what felt like an eternity and said, well, this is how it goes. Ever since that day, almost 3 years ago, I knew it was time for me to step up my game, to empower young people and old in sex education. I knew this was going to be my path, and Sex Ed with DB is just the start. This podcast is going to be a little different than the other podcasts you've listened to. Instead of one guest that we focus on each episode, you'll hear from all 5 of our voices every single episode. If you can just tell us a little bit about yourself, what kinds of identities you have, like racial, sexual orientation, if you're comfortable, what you do, and just how you identify who you are.
So my name is Ivy Chen, and I'm a sexuality health educator. And what I usually do is I go and visit schools where I teach kids and teens puberty education, sexuality health education, and I am also a lecturer at San Francisco State University. So I've been teaching sex ed in the community for 21 years and have been lecturing at SF State for 15 years. And what that sometimes means is that the college students in my class will say, very commonly, hey, you taught me when I was 10 in puberty class in the 5th grade, and it's always great to see them.
Amazing. That's so great.
It's so much fun.
The age ranges are so varied there.
It really is.
That's
yeah.
great. Amazing. So we'll just dive in. The first question we have is, how have your various social identities played a role in how you view sex, sex ed, gender, and sexuality?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely feel like that any person who's talking about sexuality, they're going to be talking about the subject through their own lens. And so absolutely, my identity as a cisgender, heterosexual, Asian American woman, that's going to play a role in the way that I perceive this. But I feel like that what is good is that part of my training is to get me to realize just the diversity of my audience and to be able to talk about their lives and their options regardless of how I view things. And I do feel like that awareness and that inclusivity is really important for any sex educator to keep in mind.
Totally. And can you define for our audience who maybe haven't heard these terms before?
Sure.
What does cisgendered mean?
Yeah, and so you know what? The thing is that people most often have heard of the term transgender, and that is when somebody of one biological sex identifies as the other gender, such as somebody who is born with a set of testicles and penis and a scrotum, but who identifies as a girl. And what the problem is that sometimes actually people don't realize that sex and gender are 2 different kinds of sexual identity. They overlap them, like the way you see on forms a lot of the time.
What is your gender, male or female?
M or F, just 2 boxes,
what
right?
What is
just
up
2
with
choices.
that? That's not correct.
Nope. Yeah, and so the thing is that whenever people hear transgender and then conversely, they're like, well, what if somebody's biological sex and their gender identity aligns. And so somebody with a penis and testicles who identifies as a boy. And in most cases, people just say that's, quote, normal, right? And it's actually, that's not the term, okay? And so even though people who are part of the majority or the dominant group, they have an identity too. And so for somebody whose sexual identity, biological sex, as well as their gender identity aligns, it's called cisgender.
Any sort of details or stories that come up about types of sex education that you've either taught or, like you said, you experienced, whether that be in Catholic school or just like as you grew older, kind of any sort of opinions that you have about, you talked a little bit about the effect of the instructor, the tone, but can you talk a little bit about like abstinence only education and
sure.
like the shame that comes with that?
Yeah, and so, I mean, I can start with that, but the good news is that in the state of California, starting in January 2016, there's a new law in place, and it's called the Healthy Youth Act. And it's good, right? Because that title actually doesn't just talk about sexuality. And so what it means is that comprehensive sexuality health education is mandated in California. Now, even though they are technically required to teach it starting in 7th grade, a lot of school districts have adopted that, the spirit of it, and have taken it down to the elementary school level, mostly 5th grade, in terms of teaching puberty class in that comprehensive way. Now,
And what does comprehensive
right, I was
mean?
just going to say, now, comprehensive is actually, I mean, it basically means it's complete, right?
Right.
And so it's not exactly the polar opposite of abstinence only, because we do talk about abstinence as a choice, but it's not the only choice. And so
Right.
what that means is that we talk about all kinds of choices, including different gender identities, different sexual orientations, acknowledging and recognizing they exist, and to talk about them in a way that's inclusive. Now, one of the tactics that I don't use and I don't think is effective that even people who teach comprehensive sex ed use is the scare tactic. And so a lot of times, even though I'll talk to my college students and they'll say, oh, we had sex ed, but I mainly remembered getting that nasty slideshow where it was just all the STI symptoms. And,
Yes.
And it was
big
disgusting.
boils, and it was very scary,
Yeah.
and just only the ugly parts.
Right, exactly. And so it doesn't necessarily cause behavioral change. It doesn't necessarily cause people to stop having sex or immediately start using condoms. It just makes them feel bad about sex. And they're like, oh, that's just gross. Okay. And then they get into this little denial box and like, but that's not going to happen to me, right? I don't know anybody with HIV, and or that they are sure that they will be able to recognize it because they've seen pictures of it. You know, but the truth is that with STIs, there are so many that can be asymptomatic, as well as having very mild symptoms that don't resemble what they see in the classes. And so, I mean, so that doesn't work, right? And so I would actually say that if we're able to teach sex ed in a way that is entertaining, that is fun, actually, that makes it so that the students come out having a very positive experience, because what we're talking about are things that are relevant to their lives that will help them to be able to make good personal decisions. And so, and you know, that also means that the choice of the educator too, as much as we can try to get a diversity of educators so that the audience whom you're trying to reach feel like that they can identify with you. And the more that they can identify with you in terms of racial, ethnic identity, sexual orientation, the more I think they feel what you're saying is credible and relevant to them.
Totally.
And it makes a huge difference, right? The source of the info and
Yes.
how they present it.
I remember over the phone, we recently spoke about how there are a lot of young Asian American students who don't necessarily always or ever possibly see an Asian American teacher in
No.
sex education.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, there's just such a dearth of Asian American representation in the media overall, and especially talking about sex, right?
Right.
So that I think for them to be able to see somebody who resembles them being able to talk about this can actually be a real aha moment for them, where they're like, hey, well, I can relate to her, and if she can talk about it, maybe I can talk about it.
What would you say is the most challenging conversation, or what's difficult about speaking about maybe a topic in sex education, and why do you find that challenging?
Yeah. You know what? I tend to find that the kids and teens as an audience, they're pretty good. You know, what tends to be possibly difficult are parents. You know, it's because, first of all, they grew up in a different generation where it's not the age of the internet. And I think that sometimes it's hard to explain, you know, you might think they're too young to hear about this, or why do we have to explain
But
so
they're
much?
just the right age.
They really are. They know more about sex than you think they do, and they're exposed to so much stuff, right? And so, especially just with how easy and accessible internet porn is, and sometimes the kids will tell me they're just surfing and these like pop up when like the porn will find you, And so in that case, I think that a lot of parents don't realize how important it is to have these conversations early and how much to cover. Anyways, and to realize actually how adaptable and flexible their kids are. And I actually think that if the parents start these conversations earlier with them, by the time I see them in 4th and 5th grade, I can always tell the kids whose parents have talked with them. And they're not only knowledgeable, but they're so much more comfortable. They participate a lot in class. But I think that sometimes trying to sell the idea that the kids need this and that they also need to continue these conversations at home, because that's the other piece, that sometimes parents say, I'm so glad you're doing this. And I say, wait a second, come back here. You're not off the hook. We're a team and we need to do this together. I see them for a week and you live with them, right? And so therefore you need to take the real intense material that I'm presenting in a short period of time and to expand on that and then to add your own values to that as well. And so I feel like the more challenging part is not my main audience, which would be the kids, but actually the secondary audience, which
Getting
are
the
actually
buy-in
parents.
from the
Yes,
parents.
exactly. But we almost always actually host a parent meeting at the school before they have the sessions in the classroom, because it is important to get the parents' support, but also just to keep them in the loop. And it's a really important topic. And also what I tell the parents is that this is a great opportunity for you to have these conversations at home. And I hope that they take me up on that, right? But I mean, I would say that this San Francisco Bay Area is just about the best place to do the work that I do. It is so supportive, and many parents are just really on board with this. So yeah, I think that a lot of times they're just kind of scared that we're opening this big Pandora's box.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, my name is Aaron. I use they and she pronouns. I am queer, I am trans, I am 25. I work for an organization called the Family Violence Law Center, primarily doing dating and domestic violence prevention education with queer and trans high schoolers in Alameda County, mostly Oakland. And I'm a part-time grad student at SF State studying education, super interested in education surrounding healthy sexuality, and really excited to be doing this project with you.
Amazing. Thank you so much for being here. Super happy to have you on the team making this podcast, and we are so excited to hear your story. So thank you so much for being here. We're going to dive right in to episode 1, which is all about sex ed and how we talk about sex. And I want to know, so you've worked with youth for how many years teaching sex ed?
3.
And what age?
The first year was middle school. And specifically 8th graders. And the past 2 years have been high school students across the full high school spectrum.
Great. And what kind of sex education maybe were they receiving, if any, before you came along?
That's really interesting. I spoke with a group of young people when I was doing sex ed who all went to Oakland School for the Arts, which is an art school in downtown Oakland, and they said that they were not really receiving sex ed that was relevant to their experience. And in my head, I'm thinking, if you go to an art school in Oakland and you're not getting sex ed, then like
where is it coming
happening?
from?
Like who's getting it? Who's learning about it? So yeah, I think, and there's full range of experiences there. So that was some of my youth experience. I also have a really good friend who's a teacher and have worked with some of her kids in my after school program. And because she's a close friend of mine, we were working on her sex ed curriculum content together. So I did know that those young people who I was working with, who were also her students, were receiving more comprehensive sex ed. So again, yeah, full range of the spectrum there.
What do you think is like the easy? So, but just because you're used to it doesn't necessarily mean it's always easy. So like, what are like the challenging parts of those conversations in your experience? Like, does one experience kind of like, go off in your brain where you're thinking like, wow, that was a really hard talk about sex that I just had with this one person?
I think the earlier on the conversations I've had about sex, the harder they were, just because practice is good, and I didn't have practice when I was first starting out, obviously. I think one of the hardest things has actually been having conversations with my parents around me having sex with people who don't have penises, and them being like, wait a second, we spent all this time coming to terms with you being a gay man, and now you're telling us you're a trans person, and now you're telling us you have sex with people who don't have penises. So like, you know, they're trying to wrap themselves around all this stuff while I'm like going full speed ahead with it. I think those conversations with family have been hard, and not because I think there's any malintent there or think there's any distrust, or I think they love me a lot. And I think that there's just like a generational gap in how we think and talk about sex. And I think that this generation, generally speaking, is a little bit more open than previous generations were.
Yes and no, though, right? Because like I
Yeah.
feel like so often I know it's so stupid, but like I have a hemorrhoid right now. Okay, I said it.
You said
I
it.
have it. It's painful. I want to talk about it with people, and like I feel like recently I tried to like bring it up, and people were like, "Oh, like ew." It's like, shut up. All right, you have a
yeah.
butthole. There are 3 million cases according to the homepage of Google that people get hemorrhoids
That's a lot
every
of
year.
cases.
3 million is enough for
Yeah.
people to be like, let's talk about that. Like,
Yeah,
you know?
yeah.
So I hear what you're saying, but I feel like we can always like be doing better, even as like young people striving to
and
talk
I think
about
that
it.
people don't want to talk about gross stuff, and what people consider gross is very diverse. And for some people, talking about sex or body parts or genitals or STIs is gross. And I want to be someone who talks more about it openly to degrossify it.
Degrossify. I love that word. So you said you were in 7th grade when you first like remember even getting any sort of sex ed. Were there any other moments in middle school or in early high school where you remember getting taught sex ed?
No. N-O.
There weren't any.
In 9th grade biology, we probably talked about what sex cells are and what happens when a male and a female mate and what reproduction is. But conversations about STI and safer sex did not happen.
Wow. And that's too common. That's commonplace.
And my high school was talking about race and racism, sex and sexism, and class and classism. And we weren't talking about sex ed.
What are some common, I feel like we have had similar experiences. I've taught sex ed in middle school as well, and there are a lot of common misconceptions about sex ed. Most of them laughable, some of them also not laughable because they actually believe the things that they're saying. So in your experience, what are some like real misconceptions that you immediately want to be like, no, let's go over what you're really saying?
That sex isn't sex unless a penis goes into a vagina. And I think that's a misconception that does a lot of bad, specifically because people aren't thinking, who have that mentality, those people aren't thinking about how to have safer sex when a penis isn't going into a vagina. And so safer sex sort of goes out the window when what you think you're doing isn't sex.
Wow, I've never thought about that before.
Yeah, and I think that, and this is something that a young person has brought to my attention, and this is a more serious thing, but the way that this young person talked about receiving sex ed made it seem like if you're going to have sex, you will experience sexual harm. And so this intrinsically connecting sexual harm to sex made it for this young person think that when they were having good, healthy, rewarding sex with someone, that it wasn't really sex because nothing bad happened. And I think that there's a lot of good in terms of having conversations around how to reduce sexual harm and how to prevent sexual harm and the connection between sex and sexual harm. But this like sex equals harm thing I think is really dangerous and does a lot of bad for a lot of people who I think like might want to enjoy sex but might stay away from it because they're worried about what could happen to them in that space.
My name is Pristine with a P. I am a first-generation Filipino Korean queer person of color. Pronouns she, her, they, them. I am, for the purposes of this episode and in life, exist in non-monogamous relationships that are really gay.
Super gay.
Yeah.
Cool. Or open-minded, as that one person told you in Vegas. How do you feel about talking about sex with friends and maybe with family? And like, what's the distinction between your comfort level, or is it roughly the same?
Friends, talk about it all day. No worries. Love it. Love talking about like my experience or relationships or sex or whatever. Don't talk about it with family besides my like brother or maybe like younger cousins, but not like parents at all. I only recently came out to my parents this past New Year's. So that's like a whole, yeah.
Do you mind like expanding on that a little? Like what that experience was like?
Or
not.
It was like a New Year's resolution. I feel a little bit disconnected from it right now, but it was a New Year's resolution. I like, when I was 16, is in my head was like it's fine, like I'll end up with a dude, like I'll never tell him, like it'll be fine, like it's cool, like whatever, like sexuality is fluid, like I'll end up with a boy, like nobody needs to know. To like I think the safety, there was like a safety level that I did such a thorough job like compartmentalizing my lives, like with family and church and friends and partners and whatever. Like I was like a fucking ninja. Like I was really, really good at it, like scarily good at it, which probably didn't do very good things to my psyche. And I'm healing a lot of those things now. And so there's a lot of connections between, like there's a lot of things around family that I recently have been exploring with therapy.
Gotta love therapy.
That just like something that I've been exploring a lot and realizing a lot is that like, and as I feel like a lot of queer folks do, is like realizing in recent years like who I've allowed to and created to be as my family. And so like when I went to college, I slowly and then very quickly stopped going home so much because it was just so damn uncomfortable, like policing how I looked or what I wore or where my haircut was or like what piercings I had or whether my phone was on iMessage versus revealing what the text said so that they couldn't see if somebody was texting me, to like any social media post ever. Yeah, so like I've very much created a family who like know me very deeply and intimately that I yearn for and long for and have found community with. And then there's my blood family who have also taken very good care of me, but who in many ways don't know me at all because of myself and because of things that they've done. But I think as I got older and a little bit of backstory, my brother is a recovering heroin addict and he's been in and out of rehabs and in and out of being lost and in and out of like nobody knowing where he was for a while, and that brought our family really a lot closer together in just like communicating beyond logistical like parent-kid relationship things. And I think as that brought us close together, I think they're like the pain of my family not knowing me or like us not actually like having any sort of like real connection, I think outgrew the fear of lack of safety as I grew more independent. And so I wrote out this really long letter, cried, told it to them the day after Christmas, which was like the day before I was going to leave. And it's definitely been a bit of a process, but I just came back from LA this most recent time. And for the first time, went to like lunch with my dad. It like felt like didn't have so many of my guards up, and like I think they're in their own process in coming to terms with things, and I'm in my own process of like letting them. So yeah.
Amazing. That
Yeah.
was a lot of really good stuff. Thank
Cool.
you for sharing. What would the best possible sex ed look like to you in classrooms?
Probably led by one of my friends, or many of my friends, and I think it would probably be a student-led syllabus around like, this is sex ed. Okay, everybody giggle. Okay, great. Like, what do y'all want to talk about? Right around like, and having our own resources around curriculum. But if people have like genuine questions about things that they have no idea about, right? About like, I don't know, things that students have, like maybe creating some sort of structure around it, but allowing it to be student led around. And also I think maybe like doing some sort of like anonymous survey or like some sort of thing to actually figure out like what types of sex people are having, like what they think about contraception, what they think about like what safe sex means, what they think about consent, like having some sort of like idea or like straw poll of what's going on now, and like having a lot of like just actually talking about real shit. That was super specific.
That was great. That's what I was looking for. I think the last question I have on this topic for you is, what's your favorite slang term for any body parts that you or someone else has?
Slang.
Like tatas is an example of a slang term for boobies, which is another slang
really?
term for breasts.
Which is another slang term for titties.
Titties.
I often call people with penises penis wielders.
What the fuck does that mean?
Somebody who wields a penis.
Sure, but where's the origin of
Just
that?
like, I don't necessarily want to like assume somebody's gender identity, and yet if someone is going to like be a penis wielder, or like, and also it's like a sword, right? It's like like there's like an agency and like wielding something. It's like, this is, hello, I'm here,
Right.
Like if I'm talking about something, if I'm frustrated about something, because I don't want to just say like men, because like men without penises or women with penises,
Right.
but like penis wielders,
Right.
because it's like something you have to take responsibility for,
Totally.
and it's like dangerous and shit sometimes, doesn't have to be.
But it could be.
Okay, well, my name is Ingrid Ochoa. My job title is Clinical Faculty Undergraduate Program Coordinator. I know it's a mouthful, it's a lot, but I work at SF State, and I pretty much work with the health ed department. So I do a lot of student management tracking. But prior to this position, I actually was a sexual health educator for on campus since 2006. And then prior to that, I've been doing sexual health education for almost like maybe 20 years of my life. So yeah, I think that's it. Oh, and then my identities. So identify being 100% Colombiana, hecha y derecha, 100%. So I soy Latina and also fluid. So I'm really, that's kind of, and also sometimes I'd say maybe in the BDSM community or kinky, maybe more kinky community, because it all really depends on how I feel and how I am that day. And it kind of changes throughout my life.
So clearly you are very comfortable talking to students about all of these types of topics, sex ed, public health, integrating all of those different areas. How comfortable do you feel with your friends and with so you said with your mom, it's been a journey and a struggle. Where are you now?
Actually, it's pretty good. I have to say, I hate to use this, but I did break her. I broke her, but it was a good break.
In a good way?
In a good way,
Okay.
yeah. Because now we really have a great relationship, and it just kind of turned where she asks me for questions, and at first I had to really be like, my mom started asking me about, because I used to do workshops on sex toys as well, and I'm a big advocate for sex positive and like pleasure and desire, and so I did a whole like workshop series on sex toys and what's the right one for you. And so anyway, my mom, I used to take her to my classes when I would teach, and it would be amazing like how I've seen her change, because I kind of forced it down her throat for her to listen in a way, because my mom would be like, I no me diga, I don't want to know. And I'm like, no, Mom, because I'm going to tell you whether you like it or not.
Listen
I'm sorry,
up,
you're going to hear it. And so, but then I would always hear her little face, even though like she's here knitting, she'd be like, kind of like peeking, like kind of, and I'm like, aha, I got you, you know?
Just eye in the room.
She was, you know, so and it would be cute because my students would be so hesitant because there's one time, you know, like my mom cracked me up because I was talking about anal sex and talking about anal anatomy, and I was telling my students about using the duck version, like how to do it properly, right? And my students were looking at my mom, looking at me, looking at my mom, looking at me, and they were like, and I didn't even think about it because I'm like all showing them, and they were just, I saw after I stopped and I looked up, I saw all my students, and they were just like, you know, and then my mom, I go, Mom, I think they're like kind of, they're in shock. And my mom's like, I've heard it all in her little accent. And it was just so cute because I was like, Mom, I love you.
Aww.
So it just, and it really helped like how she viewed, it made her be more open-minded and more accepting of me. Because a lot of the times what was hard was she, you know, I'm divorced. Thank God. I'm sorry. It's just like, thank God. It was a struggle. It was a 2-year struggle.
Totally.
Anyway, but like when I was in a relationship and I got married, the first thing my mom said was like, oh, see, it was just a phase. And that was like a knife in my heart because for me, I was like, Mom, I didn't marry him because he was a man. I married him because he was the person, how he made me feel. And it just so happened that he was a man, but that's not how I viewed him. But my mom couldn't really grasp that. And so she just got to the point, like, finally she was like, I get it now. And just to hear that was just very reaffirming.
Groundbreaking.
It was, because then it just made us be closer. And then it made her also appreciate my cousin who does identify as being gay. And and so then my mom was more like, oh, I get that now, like her relationship with her, her partner. And then my mom asking me questions and I go, ask away, and so seeing that just made us get closer, because it just made me feel like, okay, she really is trying. So it's good. So now she says partner. She and she's like,
gender neutral terms.
Yes, exactly. She's like, who are you seeing? Anyone that you're interested, like no matter what. And it's just, it's cute.
She's on board.
So
Great.
it's like, I go, thank you, Mom. You deserve like a fucking gold star. So,
amazing.
Yeah.
What is one thing that you wish you learned as a kid, looking back now at who you are? And clearly, I wish the viewers could, or viewers, the listeners, they can't see anything. You can't see anything. You come off so confidently in like who you are and who you want to, portray yourself as just this confident, like beautiful person.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. And I want to know, what would you tell your 15-year-old self? Where would you go with that advice?
And that's a good question, because I wish I had more about learning to love myself earlier on. That was I still struggle with that. Every day I wake up in the morning and I have on my bathroom mirror, I have affirmations, and I do it weekly, and I change it up because that's the one thing I wish I learned earlier on. I wish I had that conversation and that dialogue where it's like to love myself and to be proud of myself, to love the body that I'm in. Talking about body image is so, we don't talk about it as often. Now I hear it more, but back when I was in school, you didn't. And it was always like, I always felt like men were encouraged to work hard. Men were encouraged to like, oh, it's not an issue. And women, I always felt like they couldn't do it. They weren't as good enough. And always, that's the thing, it's you're not good enough. And I always kept hearing that in a little broken record in my head, that I wish I had more people in my life when I was younger to just say, you are good enough.
And like you're better than enough.
Yes. And that not to put yourself down, to appreciate what you have. And, Latin families are, this is where some of like, some of the things that I grew up with is that you're so beautiful, but you know, if you were just to lose more weight, you would be so much beautiful. You'd be attractive. You'd get more men. And not really where I was always like, for me, it was about like, I go, okay, you know what? I'm a 4.3 in high school. I'm taking AP classes. No, that doesn't matter. It's because I have a pretty face, but then I'm big. So those are things that I wish I had someone to say, no, you're good enough, you know, and more about like being positive. So more of like having somebody to talk about like body image and how media is portrayed, how that, you know, being sexualized and how all those issues really hurt how women feel when they're growing up or girls growing up, and what is, you know, having that negative like broken record in your head all throughout growing up. So I think that's what I would change. And that's why I'm really making effort with my students, even though I know they're in college, but when I did a lot of education with freshmen and in the housing department, I really made the effort of talking about body image and empowering oneself. And even men, not just, it's more of, I kind of wanted to dress to people because I do have an issue about, I love inclusivity, and I have a thing, I like to be gender neutral. And I like when I was doing sexuality, I really have a thing, like I don't like to say female anatomy or male anatomy. I don't use those words at all. And I really make the effort and emphasize that so then people are aware that it's like, we're not in the binary. We have to change the language of what we're so accustomed to using. So
I'm not religious, but amen, sister.
thank you.
That'll just about do it for episode 1. Do you have anything extra you want to add about the topic is sex education and how we talk about sex? I think we got a lot of really good stuff from you. But if there's anything you want to add,
I think people who teach it in high school, not to be afraid of it. You know, and I think that's also, it's all about getting education. You know, I know that there's a lot of programs out there. There's like Teen Talk. I know it's in, I think it's what it used to be called. I don't know what it is called now, but they too teach teachers to do comprehensive education. And that's what's important. Like if you don't feel like you have the education, go and do it. Because I think what I see a lot is like the communication is what's so necessary, and people and students see that, you know, kids see that. If they ask you a question, then you're like, and you kind of shy away from it, then you've lost them because then they know they can't talk to you. But sometimes it's like the flip side is like, it's because sometimes it's like they don't feel comfortable because they don't know the information or they don't know how to say it right. So it's like, you know, it's more of also talking to the educators. If you don't feel comfortable in something, be upfront and honest. Say, you know what, I don't know that, but I'm going to find out. I'll look it up. Or like, I know someone to refer you to. You know, I'm not comfortable to talk about this, but you know what? I know somebody who does. You know, so I'd say that.
Perfect.
Okay, I identify myself first, I guess, as a physician.
This is Rebecca Levy, my mother, and an OBGYN, a mother of 3 who runs her own private practice in Napa with over 2,000 patients.
I'm an OBGYN physician. I work by myself in a private practice right now for the last couple of years. That's only part of my identity. The major part of my identity is a mom, and I have 3 kids that I gave birth to, including you, 2 stepkids that I was around to raise part of the time as well. I'm married to my lovely second husband, so I identify myself as a white, heterosexual female, and really interested in the healthcare of women here and globally as well. I'm really interested in all of that.
Can you talk about what age you remember getting sex ed, if at all? I feel like I heard a lot of stories growing up about grandma just kind of like bullshitting or like not even talking about it, not even really wanting hugs or like any sort of physical touch. Like when was like the first time you remember talking about sex or hearing about it?
I don't remember any conversation with any family member ever being with the intent to educate me about sex. There was probably one pervasive feeling in the family growing up, which was sex is something that you don't do until you're married. There was no information about it other than a pamphlet that I got maybe when I was about 13 or so, after I had already gotten my first period and had no idea what was happening. I remember the day very well. It was traumatic, but no information at home at all. The only sex information that I think I ever got officially was something in school, which was probably in the 6th grade. I remember a time where they separated the class, where the boys went into one room and the girls went into another. We talked about some secret stuff about periods, and I don't know what the boys talked about, but it was very confusing. And the next bit of information I remember getting was from my next door neighbor, who told me that periods were something that you got right before you got pregnant.
Phyllis?
Yes. So I really had no idea what I was talking about ever. And I think that what happened when I went to high school and actually took a health class, I was one of those kids that took out a little notebook and was like, I got to write this down because this is really good information.
I need this.
I had no idea. So really, that's it about education. Really nothing. And I think I feel like I picked it all up on my own for good and for bad.
Do you remember when I got my first period? Like the day that I got my first period?
I don't remember the date officially, but I remember the surrounding circumstances. Yes.
Do you remember where we were?
No.
We were in some hotel.
Oh, yes, I do remember.
And
that.
I was like, Mom, I got my period. And you were like, That's cool. That's good. And I was like, no, it's not. And secretly I was like, that's kind of cool. But I was like hating it also.
I do remember that you and your friends all had a little conversation about it, like who was getting their periods and who could use a tampon and who.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And who had breast and who had a bra and, that kind of thing. So I do remember those kinds of things. And I do remember us having actual conversation about it, not just here's the information, Dan,
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I remember shaving, and you were like, don't shave, it's gonna grow back thicker. And I was like, she doesn't know anything, I'm gonna do it. And then I did it, and I was like, fuck, this is really growing back at a fast pace, and I'm gonna have to do this forever if I'm gonna keep this up. Okay, so what experiences have you had based on your identities or not that have led you to be passionate about sex education and women's health and becoming a doctor?
Wow. Okay, those are a little bit separate topics. Becoming a doctor is a really long story. That is on my blog. You can read if you want to. But
Plug.
Yes. But basically, becoming a doctor in general was probably something I was always geared to, but even I didn't know about it. So when I was growing up, my father, your grandpa, who you never met, always wanted me to be a doctor. I was really, really busy telling him that I didn't want to be a doctor. So I would look for other things to be that were kind of like being a doctor, but not really a doctor. So I actually went to school and became a physical therapist and worked for several years. And then when I was working as a physical therapist, I kind of backtracked and thought I might have made a mistake, that I really did always want to be a physician. So I tried, and I studied, and I went back to school, went to medical school. And it was in medical school that, in your 3rd year of medical school, they make you go through all these different rotations where you have to do pediatrics and geriatrics and internal medicine. And I did my rotation in women's health, obstetrics and gynecology. And it sounds really trite, but the first time that I was able to deliver a baby, which they do let medical students do in very busy hospitals where they don't care what you do as long as you do the paperwork, I felt like I had that aha moment. And I said, this is really what I have to do. So that was my goal from then on. And of course, studying in women's health and doing your residency and working in women's health, I just got very, very passionate about it, feeling like as I'm taking care of women, I really see that it's so important because women are really the ones who run families and raise the kids and influence the next generation, and taking care of them and letting them know about their health and making sure they know how to keep themselves healthy became a really big, not just an interest, but a real passion of mine. So that's what I've been doing for the last 20 years.
And that's what I want to do too, and hopefully will. Okay, cool. How do you feel about talking about sex with friends and family, and past partners? Like, was that always something you were comfortable with? Like, how long did it take you to become comfortable with it, or are you not really comfortable with it?
Medically speaking, I want people to have the right information. So I've made it my business to be comfortable with that. And I am. I mean, you should probably know that because we've probably spoken about everything, out there.
Yeah.
Yeah, some.
Like the day after, like the morning I lost my virginity, I was like, I lost my virginity. And we like had a whole conversation about that.
Well, as a mother, you do go through a couple of different things with that, where you, on one hand, the real me says to myself, like, if this were not my daughter and somebody came to me with this conversation, what would my reaction be? How to be safe? How are you feeling emotionally about it? That kind of thing. But if it's my daughter and I'm not thinking about any of those other things, of course, the first thing that pops into your mind is, no, you didn't. No, you didn't do that. Because the mother thing takes over the women's health thing. But then, of course, once you realize that if you react that way, your kids will never tell you anything again, you push that out of the way and you give the information and you react accordingly.
It's really interesting like that you say it like that because, growing up, there definitely were times where I was like, oh, like I feel like, you're like kind of like instilling this fear in me like about certain things. But like as a mom, I'm sure like that had to come into play. Like you just said, like there's no way for you to only think like a doctor, only think like a mom because you're both of those people.
And I have to say, one of the things for me is that ever since I've been a physician, I've always, for some reason, taken care of friends and family. So it's almost as if I've always had this thing where as soon as I take care of someone in a medical way, like my best friend comes in, I don't look at her in that examining room like my best friend. I look at her in the clinical way that I would look at a patient because otherwise you lose sight of how to take care of somebody. So for you, it would be the same thing. Like if you came to me worried about something that happened or an illness or something like that, yeah, my first thing is, oh my God, you're my daughter and I want to take care of you. But once you're asking me for that clinical advice, I look at you as like, what is the correct information? And I know that you know that I do that what is the correct information that I need to give you? What are the risks and benefits? What are the warnings I need to give you?
And I'm just like, Mom, be on my side. And you're like, it doesn't have to really do with sides, but okay. Thanks for listening to Sex Ed with DB. If you want to engage with more of our sex ed content, follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check us out on our website, sexedwithdb.tumblr.com. We would love to hear from you. Email us at sexedwithdb@gmail.com for questions, comments, and suggestions for our episodes to come. What are some funny sex ed experiences you've had in the classroom? Email them to us and we can shout them out in season 2. Our creator, host, and producer is Danielle Bezalel, aka DB. Our content writers and editors are Danielle Bezalel, Aaron Steinfeld, and Rachel Upton. Our graphic illustrator is Jessica Lynn. Our social media and marketing lead is Kat Listuvka. Our sound editor for this episode is Claudia Niles. The title of our intro music is So Low by Art of Escapism, and our outro music is by my stepdad, Bill Gant. Thank you to our featured voices and our listeners. Tune in next time.